Hello there on a lovely Friday evening. So the 2023 Formula One season is about to get underway. Looks pretty exciting. Maybe Fernando Alonso has picked the right time to jump ship for once, and yeah, will be interesting to see how he gets on. The topic of today's video is why do the teams all run some pretty extreme setups for the first test of this season. I think especially Alpine was in the news for doing this, and so why would they do this? Why wouldn't they do setup work for the race weekend just one week away? Um, wouldn't that make more sense? So the reason is they're probably doing it to improve their model correlation. So why would they do that? The reason is it's really important to get their model correlation right, because for the rest of the year, it's probably one of the few times they have the luxury of not having the pressure of a race weekend, and they can just focus on just doing the work for model correlation, so that um, by improving their models, they improve their tools to predictively work on their setups in a virtual environment for the rest of the year, which probably pays off a lot more over the entire season than just focusing on working on the setup um, for this particular race weekend. So, being an engineer and a fan of Formula One, this is kind of the workflow that I would imagine some of the teams would be using. So, in the off season, they would create a virtual model of their vehicle, um, and some teams will be better than at this than others. Just due to um, the historical tools and processes that they have in place and the experience of the people. Um, and during the early season testing, so for example, the previous weekend, they would run the vehicle at the extremes of the operating window. Now, why would they do that? It's um, I think by running the it's precisely by running the vehicle at the extremes of the operating window that you can really check model correlation. Um, Many years ago, this was more than 10 years ago, when I was creating some simulation models for a frequency dependent valve, some of the most interesting or some of the most useful tests of which I had data of were um, were tests where something malfunctioned in a prototype. Um, for example, a particular part was stuck or a certain component was actually not installed. Um, you would think that tests like that are worthless, but when the mechanic makes a mistake like that, it was actually very useful for me, being the simulation engineer for that frequency dependent valve, because um, that particular valve had many different parameters, and you could potentially arrive at the same result by changing a few different parameters one way or the other, and maybe one effect cancels out another effect. Um, but the extreme test results where certain component was missing, or there was extremely high friction which prevented a component from moving, and things like this, made it possible to isolate certain parameters and really hone in on what the individual values for each parameter would be. And I would imagine that the F1 racing teams are probably doing something similar, where by running the really extreme setups, you start to be able to um, do correlation work on particular parameters in their model. And I would imagine their models are way more complex and therefore have way more parameters than the simple little model that I had worked on. So I can only imagine how many parameters they might have. And so by running the vehicle at the extremes of its operating window and improving their correlation, they would, so after the test, they would use that data to improve the model correlation. Before the race, the next test or race, they would probably work on the setup in simulation and fine tune it in the simulator based on driver feedback. They would then predict the lap time that they could get out of the car. And then at the next test or race, they would get feedback from the drivers and the sensors and check correlation to the predicted performance. And with that data, it's an iterative process. After the test or the race, they would use the collected data to further improve the model. And so this is where I think in previous seasons, I think quite famously, in a few cases, there were cases where Ferrari was all at sea on a Friday in terms of their setups, but then they sent the data back to base, and then on the Friday night, they got Antonio Giovinazzi or whoever their test driver was at the time, I forget, to work on the setup in their simulator. And I guess because they had pretty good correlation between the real car and their simulation model, their simulation test driver could work through a whole bunch of different setup options to find a solution to whatever handling problem the race drivers had at the track, and then apply that the next day. And then the race drivers would, suddenly find a bunch of time just overnight, thanks to the work of the simulation team back at home base. I'd imagine quite a few different teams, or maybe probably all teams would apply that approach. So what do you think? Do you think the extreme setup? Do you think this extreme setups are worth the time well spent, or like, do you think it's for model correlation or something else? Let me know in the comments, and let me know your predictions for F1 2023 as well. Hope it was interesting. Till next time.